wanted to quickly go into what we're going to talk about today and some quick expectations for today. So, and I might have skipped over that slide, Jenny, so I apologize. I'm just going to go, I'm just going to talk about it. So yeah, we are an extension program at UNR Extension. We work with communities and different partners to create resources um, for you all and also for our fire districts to help communities become more fire adapted. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about different funding pathways. So to just dive in, we want to let you guys know that you guys are that we're going to monitor the chat. If you have any, we don't necessarily have any particular rules of engagement for questions, but we do want to be respectful of each other. So please raise your hand or type in the chat, as opposed to unmuting and just asking. And remember that we're here to listen and to share. So if you find that your question is taking maybe a little longer, we might let you know that we might direct you to contact us later and we can answer those offline. So some of the objectives for the session, we're hoping that by the end of this, you'll be able to list at least 3 different funding mechanisms that could support your wildfire resilience work. We're hoping that you'll understand the process and information needed to apply for grants, and then we'll identify at least 2 practical steps that you can do. Okay, so we're going to dive right in. This is your first chance to interact. Where we want you to think about projects that are going on in your communities already that you might already be aware of. And I want you to think about where that funding comes from. So if you know where that funding comes from, please put it in the chat. Or if you have an idea, we want to kind of generate some ideas and see if you guys are already aware of kind of some of the different funding mechanisms. They could be, for example, maybe you don't know the exact name of the mechanism, but it's just fire department, Forest Service, things like that. There we go. So Colorado State Forest Service. Great. So this is just affirming that you guys already, even if you're not experts on finding these funding pathways, you guys, there is some base knowledge that we can build upon as to how this type of work gets funded. Awesome. Ooh, we got a lot of Colorado representation. Oh, and we got some Nevada folks. Okay, so you guys can keep answering those in the chat. We're gonna kind of get a little high level view of this. So some of these examples, most of these examples will fit into kind of these 3 different buckets. So someone mentioned CWDG. Usually a community wildfire defense grant is part of those grants. Those funds are used to implement projects for community that are outlined in community wildfire protection plans, or CWPPs. So those tend to be large pots of funds, and they tend to be managed by fire departments, fire districts. So that's one kind of example. Fire district funded opportunities. These happen a lot. You may or may not be aware of them, but a lot of fire districts have funding to support green waste collection days, chipping days, things like that. And then the third bucket, it's not something that we always think about, but we're going to talk a lot about today, is you all, just that crowdsourcing. You guys are also a huge resource and for funding this work, and your time is investment. So we want to make sure that we remember that. This photo is from a very successful community outreach event. So when you're thinking about community wildfire adaptation, one way to picture it might be a river, and we're flowing towards something. We want to get towards having a fire adapted community. There's twists and turns along the way. And then the funding streams that flow into the river are public funding. So that could be taxpayer money, like we just talked about. Micro grants. This could be funding from foundations. So examples of that could be, I'm looking at the chat here. could be like NB Energy Foundation. Maybe there's a local community foundation that is wanting to invest in wildfire resilience. And then community crowdfunding. Just in research for this webinar, I just went to GoFundMe. There's a lot of Firewise communities who have started GoFundMes to different projects, or they're putting in match funds with their time, and sometimes just passing a hat. So there's no one funding source that all of this depends on. It's really multiple. So when we talk about public funding, some of these came up in the chat. Yeah, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan implementation funding. This is a we don't have much time to dig too deep into some of these, but if you have updated community wildfire protection plans, there's usually projects outlined within those plans that you can cite when applying for grant funds. And for example, in Tahoe, in Tahoe Douglas area, Glenbrook just got a big grant to do some fuels reduction because they had a project outlined in the CWPP, things like that. Fire district resilience grants and programs. So Nevada Fire Chiefs Association, Jim mentioned that. A lot of the fire departments and districts really invest in fire mitigation. And then agency agreements or cost share opportunities. So that might be, say you live adjacent to BLM or Forest Service land, there might be some agreements in place and potential funding mechanisms to do work on private land with some guardrails on that. Micro grants. So like I mentioned, these are smaller funding sources. They don't always require the same grant components, and the eligibility might be a little different. So those bigger pots of money, for example, tend to go to larger organizations who have proven track record of fiscal management and are often recognized 501c3s and recognized with the federal government. Your community HOA, your neighborhood, that might be going after pots of money that big, might not be realistic, but there are other sources like Tahoe Community Foundation, NV Energy Foundation. These are just a few. We are developing a one sheet with a list of resources that we know of that we're gonna email out to you guys after. And then if you're on the California side or other states where they have fire safe councils, sometimes the money from fire safe council does get funneled from the federal government, but it can be divvied out in smaller chunks. So these are really useful pots of money to, maybe buy a dumpster, rent a venue for an event. There's usually stipulations when it comes to that, though, of what you can and cannot do. And then this is a piece that often gets overlooked, that we want to make sure that people understand the value of community crowdfunding. So this photo, it was taken, sorry, I apologize, I have a scratchy throat. I'll be sipping a lot of water. This photo was taken at an event. It was a volunteer fire station fundraiser that they also used as an outreach event. So there were tables, handing out information about wildfire preparedness. There were local folks donating their time to cook food, to raise money for the fire department. And then they also looped in local businesses. So you see where that grill is on that table there. They had local businesses, donate items that they were able to sell raffle tickets for. So this was a great example of a few different funding mechanisms and pathways stacked. But the labor was all community crowdfunding. This is all volunteer labor that made this happen. So don't discount the value of your guys' just community crowdfunding capacity. So I mentioned stacking. When we talk about stacking funding, we have the visual of the streams going into the river, but then there's also, when you think about any one project that gets done, quite often there might be multiple funding sources for different components of that project. So this photo was taken from a community meeting in Carson City, Nevada. And the objective of the meeting was to communicate to this neighborhood, this Gonai neighborhood, what field mitigation projects were being done around the neighborhood that were being done by the fire department, but funded by the federal government. So there's the federal government is the fuels reduction. The fire district funding was some match and was able to also pay for their crew and for the event. You know, there were snacks and food there that was paid for by the fire district. And the community in kind contribution, local community leaders from this neighborhood helped, you know, go to door to advertise and make sure that folks were aware of this. And also organize, there were people out there handling parking in green vests. So this was a group effort. And when you think about the funding pathways for all of those different things, they're different. So just an example of how funding can be stacked. Okay, so that was a lot. This is definitely a quick webinar, but we wanted to take a minute. You guys can respond in the chat. Which example that we just covered sparked maybe a new funding idea? Crowdfunding. It's nice. Yeah. I don't know if you picked up on that. We're trying to emphasize there's a lot that can be done before you get, you know, or even in lieu of grant funding. Yay. Okay. You guys can keep responding. We want to hear your voices. I'm going to continue. Okay. So we talked a lot about crowdfunding. We are going to talk a little bit about grants though. So I'm going to go back. If in these examples, something that sparked your curiosity was, okay, we have this public funding or there are these grants available. How do I get access to that? How can I potentially be part of that? We're going to talk a little bit about grant essentials. So for folks who maybe have already applied for grants, managed grants, what's one thing that you already know that you need to do when approaching a grant? And if you don't know, that's okay. You can put that in the chat too. Okay, so we've got landscape level mitigation, preferred versus individual mitigation. That is a good tip. So especially federal grants, they don't go towards mitigating individual properties because that can increase the property value. So there's some squishiness that happens there. Read the instructions many times. Yes. Make the case. Must have a CWPP, especially for community wildfire defense grants. Yes. Most often you need to have an updated CWPP and letters of support. That's a great tip. Or a forest management plan. So this would go for folks who own 5 acres or more. And you want to do some mitigation. You need to connect with like either CAL FIRE or NDF to figure out a forest management plan. Okay, keep them coming because I feel like these are great. It's great for you guys to share knowledge with each other. So we're going to talk a little bit about grant components. So we've mentioned the community wildfire defense grant. There are a few others, but many grant programs, whether it's federal, state, or local, tend to include the same core components. So eligibility, this goes with who can apply and also what projects are eligible. And that I would refer to Christina's comment about read the instructions many, many times. So there usually are specifics. Like for example, some grants pay for equipment, others don't. Evaluation criteria. Before you start drafting your narrative, you want to know how the proposals will be judged. For the I haven't seen a grant opportunity that hasn't said how it's going to be judged. If there are, let me know. But for the most part, they share the rubric for how, especially federal grants, how these will be judged. So you want to make sure that when you're writing your proposal, you hit all of those items. Timelines. So this is, you want to be thinking about when the project is happening, but also it's a good idea for you guys to be thinking about when you need to be drafting applications if you do apply for a grant. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Match, that is what you contribute. So match shows that you are invested in this process too, and you're not just trying to get all of this funded by someone else. It shows that you are also invested. And then community risk. Why does the project matter? That goes into Michelle's comment, make the case. Okay, we're just gonna we're gonna go over this a little quickly for time. So eligibility, who can apply and what projects are eligible, right? So you want to make sure you look at make sure you are an eligible applicant and that whatever project you want to do could be funded. So the criteria could include, for example, when we're thinking about how your proposals will be judged, how is your project going to reduce the wildfire risk? How is your, a lot of opportunities, they're really looking at how this is protecting vulnerable populations. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that on the later in the presentation. But for example, folks who are have access and functional needs or disabilities or don't speak English proficiently. So there are lots of different factors when we talk about vulnerability. How does your project align with your community's community wildfire protection plan priorities? If you're writing a project and the community wildfire protection plan that the fire agency has created, if it doesn't align, then that might work against you. Partnerships and collaborations. This goes to the letters of support. When you're writing grants, the people really look for who are you going to work with to get this done. It shows that there's a stronger probability that it's actually going to get done. And then project feasibility. Is this are you biting off too much? Is this really something that we can do? So timelines. When does the project happen? So this is just real quickly, think about planning ahead and monitoring different grant cycles. Because there are a few different timelines you need to consider. There's the application window, which is usually could be like 100 to 120 days. Project timelines, how long your project is going to run, and then reporting schedules. So all of these require data, right? You need to know, there's data inputs for each stage of this. So even before you apply, you need to be trying to gather data before the application window opens. Match. What do we contribute? Match just demonstrates that you have a commitment and investment in this project, and your time is investment, and it means something. So depending on whether it's a state or federal grant, your hours of labor, whether it's doing a community event, doing some green waste removal, usually comes with an hourly rate. So if your communities band together, you can actually calculate how much time that you have to invest. This is for folks who maybe don't have cash up front. A lot of these opportunities will take in-kind labor as match. And then the community benefits and risk reductions. So your proposals should clearly explain who benefits. And just taking a step back, in general, even if we're not talking about grant proposals, any action that you guys are planning on doing in your communities, this is a good practice, best management practice to think about when planning action. Who benefits, how wildfire risk is reduced, how the project supports community-wide resilience. So that's kind of when we're talking about the individual mitigation versus the community-wide mitigation. If you do like kind of spots of houses, are you targeting particular houses that could benefit the entire community? Something to think about. And then narrative sections often include statement of need, meaning why is this project needed, how it's going to benefit the community, and outcomes and impact. So that's kind of like translating the left box into the grant verbiage, which is in the right box. So statement of need is like who benefits. Community benefit is how wildfire risk is reduced, and outcomes and impact are how the project supports community resilience. Okay. So real quickly, I know this was a lot of information. Which of these grant components do you feel most comfortable navigating? After hearing all of those things, which of these things you're like, I got it. I think I can put, capture this in a proposal, or even if it's not a proposal, in like an action plan for my community. Maybe it could be match, like how you're going to contribute. Do you guys have a good idea of your community capacity? Community benefits. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, we're getting some good feedback. Okay, well, you guys are responding in the chat. We're gonna do a little handoff here. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. I'm gonna hand it to Jenny. But yeah, if you guys want to take this time to keep responding in the chat, let us know which of these components feel most comfortable to you. Oh, Jenny, you're on mute. Just okay.
All right, here we go. Making sure I can also see the chat now that I'm sharing. All right, so we're going to shift gears a little bit and think about what you can do now. But before we do, I want you to answer this question honestly. So how stuck do you feel trying to do wildfire adaptation work without funding? Because we hear that a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we have residents definitely feeling stuck for sure. I think that's especially true for community members. And yeah. So as part of this, we want to help you feel unstuck. Yes, and definitely, trying to do things within a community where people are resistant to doing anything is very daunting, can be very frustrating, can definitely lead to feelings of stuckness. Yes, definitely. If you're at the mercy of a HOA budget, yes to all of these things. But we're hoping that maybe we can give you some strategies to at least feel like you're making some forward progress. So what can you do now for free and get unstuck? So part of it is just getting ready for grants. So that's, hopefully what this webinar is going to help you to do. One thing you can start doing is collecting data on the work you're already doing, or create a sheet that's going to help you with data collection moving forward. So Firewise has a great volunteer hour log that kind of looks at, number of hours worked, number of volunteers, how much money maybe you're spending, which can also help you kind of get a sense of what a match might be for a grant in either manpower or money. And you can really use it to gather any other information that helps show that you and your community are committed to these wildfire resiliency efforts. The next thing you can do is just start gathering information that's going to help your grant stand out. So part of that is really understanding and being able to articulate your risk. And so two websites that help here in Nevada. One nationwide is wildfirerisk.org. And then here in Nevada, there's also the Nevada Department of Forestry's Natural Resources and Fire Information Portal. So I'm just going to walk you through a little of what you can find there. So the information on this slide comes from wildfirerisk.org. And I just picked Reno because we're based here in Reno. But when I went in and put in Reno as the spot to look at, Reno has a very high risk of wildfire. It also then gives you some maps. So it shows risk to homes, wildfire likelihood, risk reduction zones, and vulnerable populations. And beneath this, it also has a section where you can identify the most relevant actions to you. And this will change depending on the role you choose, but I chose homeowners. So from this map, you can then pull it into statements that'll help you to articulate your risk. So here's what I might gather from that web page. Reno has a very high risk of wildfire, higher than 98% of communities in the United States. And I'm going to cite where I got that from. Then you can also go to the Nevada Department of Forestry's Natural Resources and Fire Information portal. And you can choose to be a basic viewer. There's another role if you're actually a fire agency or like a fire department, you can get different tools, but this is the basic viewer. So when I plug in Reno, it's going to show you that Reno itself has a very low risk because where is it plopping the point down? Well, it's in the middle of the city. And I think we can all agree that in the middle of the city, there's less wildfire risk. But then if I plug in a particular location, so I went ahead and just plugged in Collin Ranch Elementary School. So once I plug in that location, it's going to show then that, okay, now we're actually up in the hills and there is a moderate fire risk. And you can also change the tab to show the burn probability. So how might I use this to put a statement into a grant? So I might say something like the wildfire hazard for Collin Ranch Elementary School is moderate with a burn probability greater than or equal to 1 in 500. And again, citing where I got that from. So we're starting to build a case. Also on the portal, they will spit out a report for your location. This could be something that you can do right now. Maybe you plug in your neighbors' locations, and you might say, "Hey neighbor, here's this report for your house," just to start educating them. And this is just a portion of what you can find in that report, but it's going to again show the wildfire hazard potential, and it's also going to give you potential mitigation steps that would help. And this is something too that you could use if you kind of look within your community. It might help you kind of identify where the top need spots are. So from that, you might come up with some continued need, or you might explain need by saying suggested mitigation actions for high wildfire risk areas include educating the community about wildfire readiness, using wildfire resistant building materials and landscaping, and creating defensible space. So again, you're kind of showing that you've done your homework, you understand what's needed to reduce your wildfire risk. Then some grants may also ask you about if there's any vulnerable populations in your area, or you may even just want to highlight that to again understand where the highest risk is. So if you go back to wildfirerisk.org, they have a tab that you can click on which shows vulnerable populations. So and it allows you to actually select data based on like tracts within a county. And so when I did that for the Collin Ranch area, it comes up that there is a 30.3% or 30.3% of people are over 65 years old. So you could add that into your grant application. Also, 30.3% of the population is over 65 and may experience difficulty preparing for and responding to a wildfire. So that was all about articulating risk. Another thing that you can do now is to schedule a defensible space inspection through your local fire department. Each homeowner would request this individually from their local fire department, though I think if you had a whole group of people that wanted it at the same time, you could go to the fire department and say, "Hi, we all want this done." Once you have your results back, you can discuss that as a neighborhood to understand sort of what work needs to be done and where, which again helps you prepare for potentially applying for a grant or just knowing what you are hoping to do. And you can also reference these reports in your grant application. So beyond that, what else can you do? So you can always choose to partner. So one example of that might be reaching out to your local fire department to see what grants, if any, they're applying for and seeing if you can kind of piggyback onto that. And you can also start a discussion about the needs you see within your community that the fire department might not know and might be interested in going after grants and funding to start mitigation efforts. You can also look at crowdsourcing, which Megan mentioned earlier, but you can start to think about what funds can you generate just within your community. Maybe you can put out a donation jar towards that people can donate to towards mitigation efforts just out at a gathering you're having within your neighborhood or your HOA. If you are in an HOA, maybe you approach the board about whether there is the potential of getting any funds to do mitigation work in your area. If you have a particular mitigation effort that you're trying to fund, you might also send out a donation letter asking all neighbors to donate a certain amount towards that effort. So it might be wanting to do get some dumpsters or do some vegetation fuels reduction work, etc. And then remember that it's not all about money. It can also be about looking at the skills and the tools that you have within your community. So maybe somebody has a chainsaw and knows how to use it, and they could help other people in the neighborhood with removing, I don't know, some things that are harder to get rid of, maybe some junipers or something. Or maybe somebody else has gone through a training and really understands, how you need to trim back vegetation to keep it healthy, but also keep it more fire wise. So there's all sorts of things that you can think about doing right now. So in all of this that you're hearing, respond in the chat about what partnerships or resources do you think you have available right now that you can grow? Okay, so there's some great ideas. You can get your HOA to allocate a budget line item for firewise activities or hazard tree removal. I'm not sure what EFFPD is. You can, yeah, so you can talk to local fire departments in state forestry or the fire department conservation district. Yep, so there's some good partnerships. Yes, for sure. People power in the community to work on projects is huge. And you can also start thinking about, are there, can you tap maybe some youth in your area to help out with some of that, people power of just getting the vegetation you remove out to the dumpster that you obtained. Okay, so it looks like some people have found that they have good support from like their community, not so much from fire protection districts, but some people are saying they have partnerships that they'd like to grow. So great. Okay. And then when you're thinking about what you can do now, also think about what besides mitigation makes a community fire adapted. And I always like to go back to this fire adapted communities graphic created by FAC Learning Network to think about, we focus a lot, I think, on resident mitigation, which is this slice of the pie down kind of the lower left. But there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So there's 10 total kind of slices of the pie that you can think about. So you could also be looking at maybe how do you help your community prepare for evacuation? And maybe you do some education around that and make sure that you understand who might have needs and need to get somewhere. Or maybe you think about smoke preparedness and you think about, do we have anybody in the community that may need help making their home have less smoke during smoke events? So maybe you help them create a filter, or maybe you just ask people, hey, do you have a filter ready to go? All sorts of things. So real quickly in the chat, just respond, What else can you work on to make your community more fire adapted? And I think even just identifying maybe one other sphere that you want to work in can really help your communities. All right. So now we are going to have you think about how you can build on what you have. And so what we're going to do is have you think about what your 15% solution is, which means what can you do now without more resources to move you closer to your goals as a fire adapted community. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and go into our breakout room.
Jenny, we didn't talk about whether we're going to do a share out or not. Do you want to do a quick share out while I launch the poll? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and launch our post poll, and then why don't our facilitators, we go around and kind of share out some things that came up in the room. You want to start, Jenny?
Sure. So our room was talking about a little bit about Vicki mentioned the Fire Adapted Nevada Summit and thinking about wanting to dig into sort of what people value about their community and using that as a launch point to get people involved. We also talked about going beyond our own neighborhood and working with adjacent Firewise communities. Yeah, so those were some of the things that our group talked about. How about Kat? Do you want to share out what your group talked about?
Yes, absolutely. As far as the not requiring any additional resources, some of the ideas that came up were outreach, specifically about how people can landscape their yards to not be a complete forest and to also not be totally bare with no vegetation whatsoever. And then another idea was working on creating evacuation routes. And this came up specific to North Lake Tahoe. And one of the challenges is that a lot of the land along the route is CTC Forest Service. And so finding a plan to work with all of those agencies and then needing the funding to do so.
All right. Make sure and also be responding to the poll as we are sharing out. Michelle, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so we were mentioning partnering with other agencies. BLM was one of the ones that came up, and other professionals like the fire districts, obviously. It was brought up, though, that some of the fire districts are not necessarily as open to working with the communities as they might be. So then there was an idea like of being ready then to work on your own and to adapt, because we are seeing that in some areas as grant funding is being lessened. Also, providing educational presentations with professionals. And I gave some feedback there, like we work with the fire districts, living with fire. There's a lot of opportunities to bring people into the communities to do those kind of presentations and to educate.
Okay. And Megan, do you want to share out on yours?
Yeah, we talked a lot about there were some challenges on getting people together. Maybe they don't have an actual space to gather, so creating some sort of like virtual place for people to get together and share ideas and also collect data. So we talked about that, of like maybe like a website in the community. Something that Veronica shared that I thought was really great was really getting to know the needs of your community and tying your outreach and messaging to and crowdsourcing ideas for what to do, as opposed to going in with sort of already formed ideas. So making sure that whatever plan you do create is like co-created with your local community. Thought that was great. And then yeah, I think we all kind of agreed on that, and then ended on the note of anything we can do to kind of get to know each other and reach common ground and work towards common goals, that even if it's not specifically fire related, is going to yield some benefits in the future. So yeah, a lot of kind of things rooted in reliance and community reliance.